Folks, welcome Freedom Fighter 1776. I'm your host, Mark Charles Bashaw. And we've got this episode. I'm going to call it the Reprimando episode. We've got Reprimando in the studio backstage with us. I'll get to him quickly and his introduction. But first, here at Freedom Fighter 1776, we defy tyrants and we highlight those individuals, those men and women who stand upon their unalienable God-given rights and secure our constitutional republic, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. A republic if you can keep it. So you got to individually stand up and defend your rights, and collectively we secure the republic. Today's going to be a great show. Like I said, Reprimando in the studio. His name is Captain Shawn Bezwiechin, all right? And he was active duty, and I'm going to go through his biography. Captain Shawn Bezwiechin is a seasoned military leader, critical thinker, and outspoken advocate for integrity within the U.S. Army. With nearly 8 years active duty service in the infantry, he has extensive experience in NATO operations, intelligence procedures, and leadership, serving in key assignments across Europe, Poland, and U.S. Embassy in Warsaw. His education: bachelor's in psychology and a master's degree in international affairs, specializing in NATO-Russian relations. Also has a graduate certificate in Homeland Security and Emergency Management. His academic and professional background solidifies his expertise in defense strategy and global security affairs. In military experience, he was a platoon leader, troop executive officer, a squadron operations officer, an enhanced forward presence liaison officer to the Polish 15th Mechanized Infantry Brigade, a regimental operations officer, and an infantry basic officer leadership course instructor, where he ended out his military service because he was unlawfully pushed out. His operational experience includes 2 EUCOM-directed NATO missions and over 4 years and 7 months in the European theater, working alongside foreign allies to enhance military readiness and strategic cooperation. He's got Maneuver Captain Career Course graduate, Ranger School graduate, Airborne Air Assault graduate, Striker Leader Course, Basic Army Instructor Badge, Unit Movement Officer, top secret security clearance, and speaks some Russian and Polish. Like I said, folks, Plandemic Reprimando he is, and he was retaliated against for submitting protected communication to his chain of command. He is among the number of service members reprimanded during the COVID-19 pandemic for standing firmly on his constitutional individual liberties, also the federal laws which forced experimental medications and products on service members. In 2022, he received a General Officer Memorandum of Record of Reprimand, a GOMAR, from Major General Patrick Donahoe. That name might sound familiar. We had Captain Seth Ritter on. He was at the same installation with the same commanding general. More about him later. For submitting protected communication regarding unlawful injection mandates. Shawn, Captain Bezwiechin, I know I'm probably not saying that correctly. I spent 6 years in Germany. You know, the W's are V's to me, and I totally butcher it. I apologize. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Mark, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Yeah, you're absolutely trying to make it more German than it is. It's Bezwiechin, but I appreciate you, brother. Good to be with you.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on. So I want to talk about your experience in the military. Obviously, you've got an immense amount of experience, immense amount of training, highly qualified, and an essential asset. And I want you to talk a little bit more about that. And then what happened? What base were you at when you got purged from the military as well?
Yeah, so Mark, at the time all this kicked off, I was at, which is now correctly labeled, Fort Benning again. I had finished my my maneuver captain's career course there, and I stayed at Benning and took a job at the Infantry Basic Officer Leader course, as you mentioned in the bio, and had just finished off my basic Army qualification there to actually be an instructor when all this went down. And it was kind of a real eye-opening experience to have a new commander come in, meaning the battalion commander, a new commander come in during this time right before the mandate, because that's when, me personally, I was optimistic the stupidity was going to change. And the stupidity I'm referring to is the EUA mask that, we were being forced to wear, and that nagging, because I remember when the new battalion commander showed up, he was like, whoa, we're doing masks here? Because he had come from another part of the base where they weren't wearing masks. And I had the same thing happening when I had PCS'd from Germany. Like, they weren't really doing masks there either anymore. Like they had, but by the time the mandate kicked off in August of 2021, it's like the threat of COVID was essentially over for all intents and purposes. It was almost like you were pretending when you went on base that there was actually, a deadly virus still going on, because you go off base and nobody's really was wearing masks. Nothing was going on. You go on base and it's like you need to have your vaccination card to get in the gym. There's all these double standards they had created under Major General Patrick Donahoe's leadership there. So it was just very chaotic.
So let me ask you this real quick. At what point in time did you realize this was these were unlawful orders coming down? Meaning, you mentioned something earlier, emergency use authorized product. Anybody who doesn't know, generally speaking, emergency use authorized products, you must be given the option to accept or refuse, meaning you can't be coerced or put into duressful situations to participate with those products. The masking was one, the testing was one, and the injection. So you mentioned emergency use authorized products, and we know that there was never any FDA approved products. We know this whole thing was just a complete utter pandemic psychological operation. But at what point in time did you realize, like, wait a second, this is black and white unlawful?
Yeah, Mark. So when the mandate happened, to be completely honest, like, I've been very outspoken, and I've said I've opposed it in every way possible for my personal situation, from a medical standpoint, from a religious standpoint, and I said from a common sense standpoint as well, because to me, it was common sense that this was politically targeting, certain groups that had not yet acquiesced to the pressure to receive the vaccine. But to be completely honest, I kind of initially bought the bait and switch just like everybody else did. Okay, there's an FDA approved product now. Surely that's what's going to be given. I didn't really think about the masking itself until in 2022, when I believe it was actually your whistleblower testimony pointing out that, hey, this wasn't just the jabs that aren't FDA approved, it's the masking as well, it's the tests and everything else. And I think that's when it hit me, like, whoa, these tests that some people were taking twice a week were EUA products. So it was against their, violating their rights against the law.
Yeah, and in my opinion, based on my research, based on my knowledge, based on how things went down, the diagnostics were the main weapon. Everything else after that was a second and third order effect. And now there's going to be people out there that disagree with me. How could you say that? Look at what the jabs are doing. And I agree with you. The jabs are incredibly dangerous and deadly, especially given all the data we have and given all the information we have. However, if it wasn't for the weaponized diagnostics, we wouldn't actually have never gotten to that point of weaponized injections. So, that was one of the main things. But I did want to bring this up for the audience, and this is something from the military standpoint. Whether you're an enlisted service member or like you're serving as an officer, serving as a platoon leader, executive officer, operations officer, something that we learn and something that, for my own experience, has been driven in. And this is one of my certificates I received as a young enlisted airman. And this right here jumped out to me. It says, I will respect the chain of command, implement lawful decisions, and report deviations as required. And so from your perspective, from your experience, could you speak to that? What was your methodology of, one, respecting the chain of command? Because I know you do. I mean, your record speaks for itself. There's no blemishes on there, and we've seen that time and time again with these service members that they seemingly have perfect military service records up into a specific point in time, and that point in time was when unlawful orders starting to get pushed. So from your experience, how did that go down, and what did you do? I know we have some other screenshots we'll pull on the screen, but what did you do to try to redress your grievances and get your chain of command to make the right decisions?
Yeah, Mark. So the thing about the infantry branch, right? We're the dirty, nasty grunts, down there in the trenches that are tasked essentially to close with and destroy the enemies of the United States, right? We're leading individuals that are focused, the killers. The bureaucrats are some of the other MOSs. Nothing against them, but that's kind of how it's perceived. So within the infantry branch, something that I noticed was slowly during the Biden administration, we've seen more and more politics pouring in. And, the DEI stuff, as well as the transgender, like, hey, pretending you need to do this brief, you need to do this. As an officer, an infantry officer, in many ways, it became our jobs to try to shield, right, the 11 Bravos from that bureaucratic push down that was coming down the chain of command to the extent we could. And so that's what I attempted to do when this came down, right? I seen right off the bat from April of 2021, when I in process at iBullet, I had an XO, right, who was pushing everybody to get it. Now, you got to remember, this is before it was actually mandated. There was immense pressure, and I've spoken about this before. It just depended on where you were. And what I came to find out when I did, in hindsight, it's always 2020 when I started talking to other people. Under Patrick Donahoe, his number one priority was COVID, right? That became clear. And so you had these majors.
And real quick, let me interrupt Patrick Donahoe for the audience who's not aware. Let's pull him up real quick. U.S. General is battling people on Twitter. So this is your commanding general that you're speaking about, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's him. And he was very high on COVID, right? And so when you start caring about what your boss cares about when you're a careerist, right? If your boss says this is what's important, that's what takes precedence and priority at the time if you're a careerist, because all you really care about is making the next rank or your OER. And so in my opinion, it became very clear in 2021, leading up to the mandate, that there were many officers, right, within the Benning chain of command on down, that started buying into the COVID narrative, trying to make it bigger than it was. Like I said, my XO at iBullet tried to pressure me, to get it. Was asked, oh, you won't have to wear the mask no more, right? And so I seen it as all the more reason to stand up. The more it became clear, like, okay, this is politically motivated. And when it really hit a breaking point for me, because by the time I was finally notified my final appeal for the medical process, I had just finished a cycle of teaching, my platoon, and I hammered down throughout the cycle. If it's not illegal, immoral, or unethical, we're not always going to like the order coming down, but we need to follow it. However, if one of those are at play, you need to, you got to fight that. You have an obligation as an officer, because when you get to the line, that's what the 11 Bravos, right? Those dirty, nasty grunts in the trenches, they're going to look up to you and be like, sir, if we can't depend on you, who can we depend on, right? If you can't depend on the company commander, right, when you bring forth something, it's not going to get any better up the chain of command. You got to have that, that officer at the lieutenant level, even that platoon leader level, has to stop it right there. Because even though the captain is the first rank that's actually a commander, those 11 Bravos are expected to first bring something to their second lieutenants, right? And not jump the chain of command.
Right.
So it was very important for me, when I initially seen, dating back before my finalized, denial from my medical exemption, I seen my company commander, who was a fellow captain, because as a platoon trainer at iBullet, you're a captain, and I seen my fellow captain pressuring second lieutenants, like, hey, you need to get this, as well as the first sergeant, kind of coercing them, hey, you're going to have to pay back all this money, you're going to lose this, that. And so after I witnessed that, I just pulled them aside and I was like, listen, there are mechanisms in place that I highly recommend you do, right, that you utilize. And unfortunately, once I made a video kind of more in depth telling my story. I had a lot of former service members, as well as some of those same lieutenants that I tried to persuade. One of them specifically stands out in my mind. I was like, yeah, in hindsight, I was absolutely coerced into doing it. Plenty of people have said, hey, I wish I wouldn't have done it. But he just told me, yep, I was coerced. And it was very unfortunate, because even once, you came to somebody and said, hey, you have a different option, many were just too afraid of the career, losing it to get that other option.
Well, yeah, I mean, you brought up a career that for me, one of my trigger words is career. When I hear a service member say career, my career, I'm like, yo, it's not a career. You're a service member. You're in military service. And it goes back to what you were saying. They're so damn afraid to do the right thing because they're worried about getting rank. Then they forfeit their military service. Their actual lawful military obligations is military service. It's not military career. And just like that screenshot I showed, whether it's a private or a 4-star general, you have a duty to use your chain of command. It's a two-way street, right? It's a two-way street. Your chain of command gives orders, lawful orders, and you carry those out. Sometimes you might not like them, but they're lawful orders. You carry them out. And then on the flip side of that, even if there's an issue with the lawful order, you still have the ability to gain clarification upon the orders by using your chain of command, by being a big boy and standing up and talking to the individual, whether it's your NCO or whether it's your platoon leader, of the issues you're not comprehending, but ensuring you're utilizing the chain of command throughout. The problem is the military really hates the chain of command. They say they love it, but they hate the chain of command because they only see it as a one-way street. And what we've seen the last 5 years is, no, it's a two-way street, and they hate the other side of it because they just expected you to roll over in their unlawful, weaponized biological warfare upon your service members and go along to get along. And then when they saw, like, wow, he's really not going along to get along. In fact, he's making a lot of sense. And what happened what happened to you when you started making a lot of sense? At what point was there a point in time where you could tell, like, things have changed, like there's a target on your back?
Yeah, so I think I was initially, like, when my medical exemption was denied at the even before then, right? An example was, they kept forcing, they wanted everybody to wear the mask, even though all the platoon trainers and the company leadership inside the office were not wearing masks, including myself. None of us, right? Battalion leadership, company leadership, none of us would wear masks, but we expected the students to. So we throw off this facade and this double standard, right? Which I frankly apologize to my platoon for. I'm like, hey, I apologize. This is hypocritical. I got it. I know it. But this is what's going on, because I'm constantly getting badgered by company leadership. And before we switched sergeant majors, Sergeant Major, was a big COVID guy, and basically anybody that outranked me in position, not necessarily in rank, but that had the position to come down and say something, they were constantly nagging me and my platoon about wearing our masks. So I apologized until it came to a head for me personally, where I just lost it because we had just came out of the field. I was a little agitated, and I was getting badgered by the first sergeant about go fix your platoon, as well as some of the other company leadership, because they weren't wearing masks. And I was like, okay, sure, Roger, first sergeant, but are you going to go talk to Sergeant Major and demand that he takes it up the chain of command and tells the brigade commander that he violated the same COVID laws? And, of course, there's no good answer to that, because they're okay with being hypocrites, because it's somebody that's writing their NCOER or OER.
Right.
So he kind of just smiled. But that was the type of thing, early, right before I got dismissed got fired, removed, it was slowly hitting a boiling point with my level of frustration towards pretending that COVID was really necessary with the masks and all that. And so I would say, even before I officially got removed, I had already had a target on my back because of some of my interactions. And matter of fact, I mean, I could speculate, but when I turned in my platoons, when we did instructor of the cycle, there's an argument that can be made that my NCO and or myself were potentially targeted because they made the entire company revote when I handed them in to this same first sergeant I was talking about, right? That perhaps he didn't like the results, because he asked me, hey, did your platoon vote for you? And I was like, well, it was clear from the beginning that they could vote whoever they wanted to, right? It's like, you put it out. This was y'all's guidance. You gave the measures. So you wait till the entire, voting's done. And you look at mine and then say, okay, we're going to do a revote. And, you know, my NCO, in my humble opinion, was also, just by being my NCO, probably taking some shots too he shouldn't have, even though he was jabbed. You know, it was just like I was the problem child, because not only was I the highest ranking officer, or the only officer in my company, I was the highest ranking officer in the battalion. So it became clear pretty quick, you know, people started being like, whoa, you know, there's actually people that refuse this. You know, they
Hmm.
didn't give into the pressure, and that was me. So
We've
I
got
had a,
we've got an insider threat on our hands. We got to get him out of there.
exactly, you know, so even before I moved over to HHC, when I was removed, I would say there was already a clear target on my back due to resisting to the level that I had at that point.
So I mentioned that, you know, the projection in which they used, and they dubbed us insider threats, whether actually writing it down on paper and signing off on it in my own situation after I submitted medical data to a federal court and to Congress and to my chain of command. But or whether they were saying it behind your back or unofficially in an unofficial manner. I want to pull up the regulation, the Army regulation real quick. Army regulation, it's command regulation 600-20. And what does it say? It says any service member who submits to their chain of command, anyone in their chain of command, a violation of law or regulation, or if you highlight down here, a substantial and specific danger to public health and safety, they are, in fact, a protected communicator, right? And so what you were doing is you're trying to protect your chain of command by informing them that they're violating federal laws. There is, in fact, specific and substantial dangers to public health and safety here, because you're trying to coerce everybody into an experimental injection, weaponized injection, biological weapon, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't tested. It wasn't proven by no means. And again, going back to what I originally said, which is weaponized diagnostics, what exactly are we treating anyway to begin with? But that's a whole side psychological operation that I won't get into. So you're over here, you're submitting protected communication formally, informally to your chain of command. You're a protected communicator. They label you the insider threat, right? They label us the insider threats. And then they go on to remove you from teaching. Is that correct? So they remove you from being an instructor, and where did they end up putting you? And then what did they end up doing to you while you were sitting in that whatever that isolated position they probably had you in?
Yeah, so, you know, a couple ironic things. When they removed me, we were hurting very bad on manpower inside the company, platoon trainers. So they immediately made, you know, the next cycle of lieutenants suffer because they didn't have that officer mentorship. They didn't immediately have anybody to replace me. But this was so
Wow.
important, even though, you know, from everything that I was being told prior to this kicking off, I was doing well according to my, you know, battalion commander and, you know, XO. Like, they were wanting me to stay there and take command. So everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, I was now, like you said, essentially an insider threat. I was this crazy individual because I was refusing a jab, an experimental jab. And they removed me and put me in HHC, ironically, to manage the legal platoon, right? Like
Really?
some of the
Wait,
same
wait.
lieutenant.
So they put you in HHC to manage the legal platoon. Is that the new accessions that we're going through the OCS course as to be legal officers?
Well, so no, it was when I say legal platoon, it was individuals that I bullied that had messed up and put themselves in some type of legal situation. Like, DUIs, they got caught stealing, something like that. Anything they failed,
Oh, I got you.
they were getting kicked out of the Army. So that's what I mean by legal platoon, to include what I call the COVID lieutenants. So they initially took all the lieutenants that had some type of pending exemption and put them inside the legal platoon.
With the actual oftentimes criminals. I mean, they allowed pedophiles to stay in the military, known pedophiles to stay in the military, and kicked me and you out for following the law.
Well, let me just rewind really quick, because this is a very important point, right? When we're talking about the quality versus quantity, because they put themselves in such a bind where they needed people, clearly. Right before I got removed from my platoon trainer position, I went to the same commander, that had failed height and weight, and was now writing my negative counseling to, start my process of separation from the Army that he laid out. I brought him forth a lieutenant that was deemed a pathological liar. And it was a female. She was originally in my platoon. And then I had speculated early on from like when you have these lieutenants, you meet with each of them, the platoon trainer. I met with every single lieutenant in my platoon, kind of like, hey, tell me about yourself, whatever. And she had like a really good sounding resume to include. She supposedly spoke Russian. So I was like, okay, Tigavri Sparuski, like, you speak Russian. And I think she didn't realize much about my background. So one of her lies just immediately jumped my spidey senses, because she didn't respond. It was almost like she didn't understand what I had said. And so I just gave her the benefit of the doubt, though, like, okay, maybe she's being humble, because she was supposedly almost fluent in it. But nevertheless, that was like, initially I had a bad feeling. And about halfway through the cycle, I told my platoon sergeant, the E7, who was, helping me get, raise them, show them what a good NCO is. I looked at him one day and I was like, man, she's either got, the most awesome story, or she's a pathological liar. I had told him, but I just kept giving her the benefit of the doubt, because, we needed people to graduate. The Army at large needed platoon leaders. But the final straw with her specific case was the end counselings. At this point in time, I had already did a trade. Myself and another platoon trainer had traded. I traded her out and got a different lieutenant to finish off the cycle. And at the end of the year, I had another student that was like, man, so-and-so is a pathological liar, right? And I was like, what? I was like, really? I suspected that. I was like, tell me more. So I heard it. And then I go to the other platoon trainer and I'm like, hey, man, let me read the peer evals for this, second lieutenant, for this lieutenant so-and-so. I read them, and sure enough, inside her new platoon's peer evals was her platoon mates saying she was a pathological liar, essentially. So I said, okay, this is too much evidence. She's clearly a pathological liar, right? I got people from my platoon. I got people from her new platoon. So I brought all this evidence forward to the company commander, who within 2 weeks was about to start the separation process from the Army. But he just kicked the can down the road and said, okay, they're moving over to HHC. That's to basically go out process Eyebullet to go off to their platoon. He wanted to kick it down the road. That's now their problem, instead of like addressing it. So that's just like an example of the politics.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I don't know what ended up happening to her. I'm not really, whatever happened to her. But the fact is, there was a pattern where you had individuals getting DUIs, you had individuals beating their spouses, you had assaults, you had rapes, you had pedophilia, you had all these individuals, and they were actually able to stay in the military. And a lot of them are continuing service today.
100%.
And then you've got the insider threats of the service members who just didn't want their subordinates, the soldier, the airman, the marine, the sailor, not to be experimented on by these weaponized products, and for their chain of command to follow the actual law. And we're the ones tossed out. We're the ones that were threatened with Leavenworth imprisonment. We're the ones that were banned from all Army Public Health Center facilities for 400 plus days. Some of these students, I know a special warfare student, he was stuck in a solo classroom by himself. It almost sounded like a freaking prisoner of war SEER environment, which, to be honest with you, a lot of the tactics they used were a lot of the tactics I got trained when I went through SEER training. And so a lot of the countermeasures I was employing was what the government actually taught me when I went through SEER training for a contingency environment. Little did I know I would have had to use that later on down the road during the pandemic. But I digress. Craziness. So I wanted to bring up, I talked about the protected communication. So here's your GOMAR. You got a GOMAR. This is your rebuttal to that GOMAR. And anybody who doesn't know, that's a general officer memorandum of reprimand, right? It's basically for an officer, a military service killer. You're not going to be serving in the military much longer after you receive one of these. And you submit a rebuttal to that, and you properly inform this guy of the violations of law in detail. I've read it, folks. You've explained it in detail. You gave him all the tools to make the right decision, in which he did this, and so this is his determination on your rebuttal, in which he signed off on his own crimes, and he put it officially permanently filed in your record. And so from this point, how much longer until you left service? And then real quickly, I want to touch on, have you been contacted by the Army to come back into the military with this whole executive order that was signed to bring service members back into service who were unlawfully discharged?
Yeah, Mark. So going back to the rebuttal, you correctly pointed out, I laid out multiple points, right, including its EUA, the health con status did not support even getting these shots at this time, all types of points that none of which he addressed.
The federal law, you laid out the federal law, you laid out the VAERS data, which was the government's own data showing all the deaths, right? Correct. And adverse events.
Correct. So it was very disappointing for a 2-star general to tell me, he's looked at everything, yet he did not respond to anything that I brought up. None of the points I brought up were addressed. He just gave me a generic typed up thing. My battalion commander's telling me, hey, I think the Army's making a big mistake. Yet in his GOMAR, he's filing determination. He's telling me he's spoken to the chain of command. So, and mind you, this is going to kind of lead into, your question about what happened at the time wave. At that point, when I did my GOMAR rebuttal, I was under the impression, which it was a correct impression, that I had a religious exemption pending. So I put that in my GOMAR rebuttal as well. Like, hey, sir, can we allow this process to play out? I have a pending religious exemption. I would like to see where that goes, right? Let the Army tell me. And that wasn't addressed either. And it was eventually determined that my religious exemption request was, quote unquote, not processed. It was never filed, is what it said. My company commander told me it was not processed. So I didn't really get, the normal process to play out there that the Army had set up. I wasn't afforded that opportunity. So I was forced into essentially doing a memorandum for record stating what had happened. Like, hey, my company commander has been lying to me, because the moment that he told me it was denied, my religious exemption, I asked for paperwork. None was given. He told me he would get me something, right? I was like, okay, well, it's denied. Can I get that in writing? And then it was, we'll get you something. And that carried on for a few months until it ended up being everything come to a head around August 30th, or just before. It was about August, mid-August. August 30th was supposed to be the exact date that I was separating officially, but it ended up going to the end of October.
2022.
Correct, yes. But in August, I managed to get a meeting with my brigade commander at the time to explain, like, hey, what was going on, and explain, like, hey, they have not allowed this religious exemption, and also to tell him, like, hey, hey, sir, I agree with Congressman, Thomas Massey. This is a crime in progress. Like, this is what's going on. I quoted, Congressman Massey, like, hey, this is absolutely a crime in progress, in my opinion. And at this
I mean,
point,
it's not even your opinion. That it's a fact. It was
it's
a
fact,
crime in
right?
process. Like, it's black and white. I often refer to it. It was completely belligerent. It's actually an act of war on our forces within the military, where you had these generals weaponizing mandates, unlawfully weaponizing these mandates against their service members. And I get it. Some of them, some of them might not have known the minutia of the law, but in your situation, my situation, no, they were given it. They were served it in formal documentation, and and then they signed off on retaliatory crimes after the fact, and now probably wanting to cover it up as well. But going back to sorry to cut you off, but going back to what you were saying.
Yeah. So at that point, I had officially notified everybody. I worked my way up through the chain of command. My company commander, my battalion commander, and then I had my meetings with the brigade commander. The first meeting was essentially him saying, like, hey, yeah, I'm not really prepared for this conversation, because at that point I had handed him your whistleblower testimony to show them, like, hey, look, here you go. Like, this is the ammunition you need to actually stand up, in case
To
you were
work
confused.
with you instead of against
Right,
you.
right. Like, don't take my word for it. I was like, there's no FDA approved vials on Fort Benning. Don't take my word for it. Prove it to me. And here's your ammunition. So at
Yeah.
that point, I'd worked my way up throughout the chain of command. And I very quickly realized that all I could do was utilize IG, because they had, my company commander had lied to me, told me he was going to give me the denial paperwork, and didn't. So I ended up doing the IG, where my initial case officer through IG had found that, let's see, the quote is intentional delay of personnel action request, right? Like, I had submitted something and it was intentionally delayed. They had found substantiating evidence that had occurred, which obviously I knew they would,
Yep.
because I gave them everything on a silver platter. Like, here's the documentation, man. This is simple, like, I talked with the chaplain.
Yeah.
Chaplain's given his endorsement to me. I talked with the battalion commander. Like, I utilized the chain of command. I was respectful to everybody till the day I left the Army, about laying out my case to make sure I over communicated very clearly what was happening. So I didn't mince words. I let them know
Yep.
that they were now complicit in this. So I left ultimately in October of 2022, and immediately put in my FOIA request to see, like, hey, where's my what happened with my investigation here? Because no IO ever came and talked to me, right? If there was an investigating officer, right, if any 15-6 was done or any type of investigation, they never came and spoke with me. So I put in my FOIA request to, like, let's see it in writing, like what actually happened, through the IG. We're over 28 months later and it still has not been returned to me. So that's where I'm at in terms of that. And to answer your question regarding have I been contacted by the Army, I have been contacted by the Army in terms of coming back in, identified as one of the individuals. And I started, of course, the normal questions that they really didn't have good answers for. Anything regarding accountability, there's no good answer that I've heard yet. And then some of the nuances within each individual circumstances that they are not ready to address, because if you're not following this issue closely, then you're probably not prepared to speak on it, right? You know that.
Well, and you're talking to individuals who went along to get along, and they either have no utter understanding of what occurred and the fact that they were experimented on, and they've got this experimental serum flowing around in their bodies, or they do, and they're incredibly spiteful towards the individuals who refuse to participate with that, or some of them actually know and are incredibly have a moral injury over the fact that their government experimented on them in such a belligerent manner. We're almost out of time. So I did want to go back to, so they did contact you, and has there been a clear forward path from the Army on getting you back into active duty service and establish you back where you were?
There has not been, in terms of like laid out. Like I said, they gave you, the generic service center number, and I've talked with multiple individuals. I've talked down as recent as 2 weeks ago with a sitting brigade commander. There hasn't been op orders like pushing out the specifics, because we all want to know, like, how is this actually going to be implemented, right? Like, how do you make up for this? Yeah, so back pay is cool and all, but how do you really make up for this? And I think those are the nuances that they're sifting through right now at the DoD, trying to figure out as each of the individual branches are coming up with their course of action to make this happen.
Right. And we've got this going on in the military, folks. Just a few days ago, this is a Children Health Defense, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s organization. They have a military chapter, and it says, we have heard from 100 service members who are currently being discharged or facing disciplinary action for flu shot refusals, with the chain of command denying their rights to medical and religious accommodations. So again, this continues to persist, this irrational, illogical, unscientific mandating of these jabs upon service members, and it seems like they're doing the same thing. Now, we were talking about the nuanced aspect of the COVID-19 one being completely unlawful, but there's an aspect of the fact that, like, there is no justification to pump service members with these shots on an annual basis, other than the millions and billions and trillions of dollars going to big pharma, right? Because all the military chain of command ever does is say, well, it's military readiness, and they just mouth breathe military readiness. But you actually have to have proper scientific justification to be injecting these chemicals and toxins. Or in their case, like, no, they protect us, right? They protect us from these viruses. But again, it's a racket. It's still going on. It would be really hard. It's almost like going back into the belly of the beast, if they were to let us back in. Now, I'm not opposed to continuing service of our nation, and and standing upon laws and orders and carrying out lawful orders and carrying out laws and doing the right thing. I did it for 17 years. It but there came a point in time like, no, like that's blatantly unlawful. It's not even close. And so I think you and I are on the same page, and it'll be interesting. I do want to have you back if possible. I want to talk about this and see if that progress to enter the military has progressed any. So I would love to have you back. Any last words? I do want to pull up your banner real quick. Where can people find you? So that's where people can find you on X. You have an X account. That's the handle for people to come get a hold of you. But any last words?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Mark. Just I'll say about the flu shot, right? Something I like to throughout my military career. I use the 5 principles of patrolling, right? I like to hammer that. If you use those, a lot of times it's almost applicable to anything. And something about the flu shots, just like the COVID shots, it did not pass the common sense test there, right? That's one of the 5 principles of patrolling is common sense. It's common sense to me and anybody else that you can't tell somebody as infantry officers are signed for tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment and responsible to bring home the men and women around them, right? In the event that they're in combat, you entrust somebody to do that, but yet you don't trust them to make basic medical decisions like it's best for me or not to take a flu shot, something that doesn't even prevent me from getting the flu.
Absolutely not. I would argue that I remember, I mean, what happened to the flu? What happened to the flu during the whole pandemic? Why don't we talk about that? Did they just change the labeling of the weaponized diagnostic kits and we just shifted statistics from flu to COVID-19? I don't know. It's not rocket science. Anyway, God bless you, brother. Thanks for coming on the show. Much love. Folks, check him out. Check him out at Uncle Bez. Get a hold of him. If you're a service member out there and this resonates with you and you want to talk to somebody about your experiences, what you experienced in the military, trying to do the right thing, trying to use your chain of command and then getting destroyed, reach out to us here at Freedom Fighter 1776. Go over to the website, check it out. We also got Freedom Financial 1776, where you can do your own research, right? Do your own research, look into some of these new technology coming out to where you can be your own bank. And that's the episode. We'll see you on the next episode. God bless. Much love.